everyone, it's Manny with MedCoach TM, and today we're going to be talking about the complement pathway. So, the complement pathway is honestly something that students struggle with so much, but really it's super easy to understand if you just look at the similarities and the differences between the three pathways. So that being said, we're going to start off with the classical pathway. Or actually, first let me tell you what the main goal is of the complement pathway. The main goal of the complement pathway is to convert C3 into C3b. So what they want to do is just make sure that C3b is able to be converted is able to be formed because C3b is an extremely important opsonization agent. So what it wants to do is that it's going to go and target molecules and basically mark these molecules for opsonization so that neutrophils and macrophages can come and get rid of these molecules. So let's start by talking about the classical pathway, and I'm going to do the classical pathway in a green color. So classical pathway contains something called C1. C1 has 4 components, which I personally think are not too important to remember. And then they have a C1 inhibitor. So C1 basically looks like 4 components, and then it has this C1 inhibitor present as well. There's going to be a microbe present here. Let's just put microbe, or MIB for microbe. And this microbe is going to have a certain antigen, and this antigen is going to be bound to an antibody. I know antibody is actually supposed to be a V, but I accidentally made this a circle, so that's our antibody. So what's going to happen is that C1 is going to recognize that there is this antibody antigen on this microbe, and it's going to be like, whoa, like that antibody is on that antigen, on that microbe. This is a foreign particle and it should not be here. So what it's going to do is this C1 component is going to recognize this, and this C1 component is essentially going to pop off. Once this C1 inhibitor has popped off, this C1 component is now active. It's happy. It's like, oh my God, I'm going to start doing my work now. I have to get rid of this microbe. The C1 will bind to the antibody antigen complex, and the C1 inhibitor will pop off. So C1 is active. So I'm going to draw C1 one more time. So C1 now is active, and what C1 is going to do is it's going to cause for the conversions of C2 into C2A plus C2B, and C4 into C4A and C4B. C2B and C4B are going to be the ones that are helping us with our complement pathway. So for now, we can forget about C2A and C4A. So I'm just going to cross those out. And these C2B and C4B are going to come and form a C2B4B complex. Now this complex is formed. What's going to happen after this complex is formed? This complex is going to act as a C3 convertase. So what that means is that it's going to result in the conversion of C3 into C3A, C3B. And C3B is extremely important because C3B will then go and form a complex with C2B, 4B. So then eventually we will get C2B, 4B, 3B. Now we have a brand new complex. Now that brand new complex is extremely important because that brand new complex is going to act as a C5 convertase. So now we have C5 convertase, and this is going to convert C5 into C5A and C5B. And again, C5B is very important in our complement pathway. So let's just take a little bit of a break. I'm just going to go and review what we just talked about. So we talked about the 4 components that have a C1 inhibitor for C1. The C1 is going to bind to the antibody antigen complex, and the C1 inhibitor will pop off. C1, which is now active, shown over here, is going to convert C2A or C2 into C2A and C2B. It's also going to convert C4 into C4A and C4B, which I have shown right over here. The C2B will form a complex with C4B over here, and it's going to act as a C3 convertase and convert C3 into C4A and C3 into C3A and C3B. C3b will form a complex with C2b and 4b, and there will be a brand new complex formed called C2b 4b 3b. And this C2b 4b 3b is going to act as a C5 convertase and convert C5 into C5a and C5b. So that is our step so far to obtain not only C3b, which we said is extremely, which is our main goal of the complement pathway, but also we have now obtained C5b, which I'm going to talk about now. C5b then goes on to bind on to C6, 7, 8, and 9, and forms a complex. I'm running out of room here, but it forms a complex which is called the MAC. Sorry, the MAP. So it's called the MAP, which is the membrane attack protein. And this membrane attack protein is going to convert, or it's going to create holes in pathogen membranes, and this will result in the pathogen death. So this map being formed is extremely important, because we want this membrane attack protein to make sure that it goes and it kills these pathogens. The membrane attack protein is what's killing these pathogens. Now, membrane attack protein is sometimes also called membrane attack complex. Personally, the book that I studied from called it the membrane attack protein. So you might see it as membrane attack complex. It really just depends on which resource and what book you're using. So I am going to put also membrane attack complex, just so that if you do run across membrane attack complex instead of membrane attack protein, you don't get confused. Now, what we're going to talk about is the lectin pathway. So the lectin pathway is very similar to the C1 classical pathway. The only difference is that, remember in the beginning of the classical pathway where the C1 bound to an antigen antibody complex and that caused for the C1 inhibitor to pop off. What's actually happening here is that mannose binding lectin protein is going to bind to the mannose that is found on microbial walls. So it's similar, but it's different. So we're going to have, let's say we have a microbe over here. I'm going to erase some of these things. Let's get rid of some of this stuff here. So let's say that we have a microbe. I'm going to put MIB for microbe once again. And this microbe has this like lectin thing over here. There's going to be a mannose binding lectin, which is going to come and bind on to this. And once this binds, the steps are the exact same as the classical C1 pathway. We're going to have our C2 becoming C2A and C2B. We're going to have our C4 becoming C4A and C4B. And then it's just the exact same. We're going to have the C4B and the C2B forming a complex, acting as a C3 convertase, C3B being formed, them forming a complex becoming C2B, 4B, 3B. And then that acts as a C5 convertase, C5B being formed, MAP or MAC being formed, and pathogen death happening. So really, all you really need to remember between the classical and the lectin pathway is that the only step that differs is the beginning step, this one and this one. Otherwise, all the other steps are the exact same. So there's really nothing that you need to remember extra about the lectin pathway if you just understand the classical pathway. So now lastly, we're going to talk about the alternative pathway. So the alternative pathway is somewhat easier because it's literally just the spontaneous creation of C3b. It's spontaneous. It spontaneously creates C3b. So what's happening here in this pathway is that there is going to be a microbe. So let's bring back our microbe here, MIB. And this microbe is going to just spontaneously bind C3. C3 will just bind onto this microbe, and that will result in the conversion of C3 into C3A, C3B. This C3b now is able to go and bind onto another protein, which is called BB. Once it binds onto this protein, there's going to be a complex called C3b BB that is formed. And this C3b BB is actually going to act as a C3 convertase. So it's going to convert again C3 into C3A, C3b. And then now this C3b is going to go and form a complex with this already C3BBB. So you're going to eventually see, running out of a little bit of room here, so I'm going to move up here. We're going to see a C3BBB 3B complex formed. And then this C3BBB 3B complex is going to act as a 5 or a C5 convertase. And it's going to convert the C5 into C5A and C5B. And then after that, these steps are the exact same, where C5B goes on to bind onto C6, C7, C8, and C9 and form MAP or MAC again. And then this MAP or MAC is going to then go and create holes in the pathogen membrane and result in pathogen death.